In this video, I'm going to explain how to create Android activities and use explicit intent to switch between activities. An activity is a single screen that users interact with. An application may contain multiple screens. We need to manage how these are displayed to the user. Not only that, we need to be able to push data from one activity to another activity, both forward and backwards. So think about activities as being a stack of playing cards. When your application launches, you've got a single card containing your user interface. If you launch a second activity, the second activity gets launched over the top of your first activity, just like placing a second card on the pile. And you can stack these cards as high as you want. To remove an activity, you press the back button that's located at the bottom of the screen. And every time you press the back button, it throws away the topmost activity. Now, when we add a new activity, you've got to remember that for each activity, we need both a view, which is the XML layout file, and we also need a view controller, which is the Java file. And in addition, every view we add adds an entry to the manifest file, which is a special XML file that we'll talk about later. So to add a new activity, the easiest way is to right-click on the layout folder, choose New, and then choose Activity from the list available. And you can specify the name of the layout file and also the name of your view controller file. As you can see, once you've created a new activity, it adds a new Java file to your hierarchy, and it also adds a new XML file into the layout folder. Now, the manifest is a special file which contains information about the entire application. In particular, every activity must have an entry in the manifest, otherwise it won't launch properly. And as you can see, the manifest is broken into several sections. There's a user's SDK tag, which contains information about the SDK version you should be using, which contains information about the SDK version that you are targeting. And there's also a large application tag. And inside the application tag, we have each activity listed. And as you can see, the second activity has a name and a label, but your first activity, your main activity, has a special section called intent filter. Now, the intent filter contains two important tags. The first tag shows that it's the main activity, it's the launch activity when the application first loads. And the second tag, which is the category, tells Android to place an icon on the desktop which launches that activity. So we've now shown how you create additional activities. But to be able to launch a second activity from an existing activity, you have to understand something called intents. Now, there are two ways you can deal with intents. You can specify a particular activity by its class name that you want to launch, or you can ask Android to perform an action and let Android choose the most appropriate activity. For this lab, we're going to focus on the first sort, which is called an explicit activity. For this lab, we're going to focus on the first type, and these are known as explicit intents. And the simplest way to launch an activity is to create an intent object and then call the start activity method and pass the intent object to that method. And that will allow you to specify the name of the activity you want to load by specifying its class name. Notice that we use the .class extension for our view controller file, not .java, because by the time you get to run it, it will have been compiled into a .class file. To pass data into a second activity, we need to call the putExtra method of the intent. And the data is specified in key value pairs. In this example, I want to pass the value mark, and I want to store that against the key of name. When I've done that, I can start the activity in the usual way. Once I've passed some data to my second activity, I need to be able to read that data back into my activity to use it. So to do that, we create a bundle object, which in this example I've called extras, and you call the getIntent getExtras method, which are chained together. Once I've done that, I can retrieve values, but it's always a good idea to see if the value has been set. If it hasn't been set, you're probably going to crash your application. So I've got an if statement which says if extras.getStringName is not equal to null, retrieve the name and display it in the log. Notice I use getString because the value is a string. I've got getInt, getDate, getFloat, and so on for different types of data. The final step I'll show you here is how to pass data back from a second activity to the first activity when the activity shuts down. Now, to do that, we have to change the way we launch the activity in the first place. And the first bit's exactly the same, but when we start the activity, there's a different method we called start activity for result. And as well as the intent object, we pass it an integer value, which is the request code. And every activity that you launch, you should assign a unique code to. So your first activity knows which has just been closed. In the example, rather than having an integer value specified as a number, I've used a constant. I've defined request underscore code to have the value of 1, and then use that constant value in my start activity for result. To create a Java constant, you have to use the private static final keywords before you define the variable. And we normally define these outside the method declarations to make them global scoped. So now we've started activity for result, we can send our data back. And it works in a very similar way by using the intent object. So again, we create an intent, we put extras in there, so we can add. So in this example, I've assigned a value Coventry to the key uni, and then I set result. The first parameter is how the activity shut. And because the activity shut down in a controlled manner, we say result OK. If you've just cancelled the screen, you get result cancel. And the second parameter is the intent object, which contains the data. Finally, we call the onBackPressed method of the superclass. I'm going to re-record the whole section. Once you've started activity for result, we can pass data back to our first activity. And we have to implement a special method called onBackPressed. And this gets triggered when the back button gets pressed on the phone. And to send data back, we create an intent and we put extra values into the intent. So in this example, I'm assigning a string value of Coventry to the key of uni. Once I've done that, I call setResult and specify two parameters. The first one is how the second activity closed. Normally it's result OK or result cancel, depending on whether you've cancelled the operation or completed the operation. And the second parameter is the intent object, which contains our data. When I've done that, I call the onBackPress method of our superclass, and then that's finished. And the final step to read the data is to create a special method in our first activity called onActivityResult. And the parameters are the request code, which was the code we generated when we launched the second activity, the result code, which is OK or cancel, and the intent, which contains any data that's being passed back. So I've got a nice if statement which says if the result code is result OK, and the code was the correct request code, I can then create a bundle object and call getExtras on data, and I can then retrieve my values based on their keys. So to summarise, we need to implement two methods in our main activity. We need to create a method to trigger the launch of the second activity, which is normally a button press or something like that. And we need a special onActivityResult method to listen out for the data passed back. In our second activity, we need two methods. We need to add code to onCreate to retrieve any data passed to the activity. And then we need a special method called onBackPressed, which sends data back to the first activity. One final piece of information you might find useful is I've shown you how to close an activity by using the back button. Sometimes, for example, if you want to cancel an activity, you would press another button. To close the current activity, you would choose the finish method of the activity class, and that will close the current activity.